Okay, well, I'm here today in order to show support for the troops in the most meaningful way I can think of by keeping them at home, safe from a combat zone that they should never be sent to begin with. We have an unelected president with a constitutionally illegal war, an undeclared war, that's essentially put the U.S. on the path of carrying out aggression as foreign policy. That's going to isolate the United States, going to result in hundreds of thousands of casualties, Americans and Iraqis. It has nothing to do with the war on terror, since there's no plausible connection between Iraq and al-Qaeda. It's essentially an adventure as part of a preliminary to a kind of global empire that Bush and his advisors have been planning at least since 1998, when a number of them wrote a letter to Clinton asking him to invade Iraq. And they were ignored at that point, and so they formed a study group to decide the details of how to do it in September of 2000, before the election even occurred. And then, of course, in the election, Bush didn't win. We have a president by judicial coup, someone who seized the White House because he has 5 cronies on the Supreme Court that could hand it to him. So we have an unelected president carrying us into an undeclared war against an inappropriate enemy that was already destroyed essentially as an industrial country by the first massacre against Iraq carried out in 1991. And something like 40% of the troops in that first Gulf massacre are now suffering from one form or another of Gulf War illness, and the military, far from doing anything about it, is planning to use depleted uranium again, as they did last time around in this war. And depleted uranium essentially turns it into a kind of nuclear war, at least in terms of radiological waste. So that the area is bombed in '91 with 320 tons of depleted uranium, now have 14-fold increases in childhood cancer as a result of the exposures to the particles of depleted uranium that are blowing around the desert. By the way, the several hundred thousand troops that are now in place in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait will be inhaling that dust right now. And what we're here to do is to try and stop the Vermont Guard from being further sent in the service of this undeclared and illegal and immoral war. Since the U.S. bombed the sewage treatment and water purification plants back in '91 and has since illegally blockaded the flow of medicines and repair equipment and chlorine bleach for the water purification system, so that they've essentially created a kind of widespread epidemic of lower intestinal tract illnesses that have claimed the lives of more than 1.2 million Iraqis since 1991. More than 500,000 of them children. The country is just barely managing to keep people alive with the limited food and medicine that they have available. If you bomb a country like that, aside from the people you will kill outright in the bombing, what the Pentagon calls euphemistically collateral damage, you're going to have a very large number of people facing massive food insecurity as a result of bombing a system that was only barely functional and barely keeping them alive to begin with. Iraq represents no military threat to anyone. Even the neighboring nations in the Persian Gulf have said they're not worried about Iraq. The United States is intent on going after Iraq, not because it has any connection to terrorism, because in fact there's a long-standing enmity between al-Qaeda, a fundamentalist Muslim group, and the Ba'ath Party that Saddam Hussein heads, which is a secular, non-religious formation. So that from the point of view of al-Qaeda, the Ba'ath Party is the worst kind of westernizing, modernizing party, and they have absolutely nothing in common. When Osama bin Laden, in the tape that was attributed to him a few weeks, said that Muslims should support the people of Iraq, he wasn't in any way speaking about supporting Saddam Hussein, and supporting the Muslim people of Iraq is consistent with his being altogether hostile to the current government. So there's no justification in terms of the official reasons given. The CIA has in fact said on the one circumstance under which Iraq might carry out a terrorist attack is if they felt that they were about to be massively attacked by the United States and they had nothing left to lose. So it looks as if the Bush administration policy is to provoke terrorist attacks, presumably so they can shred what little remains of our Constitution in the wake of the next 9/11. I think that we need to prevent the president from that provocation by preventing the war. And you can be sure, notwithstanding they are blowing off all the protests around the world in the last few months, they're paying very close attention. The war is not inevitable. We can still stop it. According to the United Nations Charter, it's not legal to attack a country that hasn't attacked another country first. To do so is a war of aggression, which is what Bush is proposing the U.S. carry out, which will isolate us in international terms. And I take it the reason he's doing it is because he wants to build a 21st century American empire that can dominate the rest of the planet in the absence of any superpowers being able to stand up and challenge the U.S., as was the case during the Cold War, when whatever you think about the old Soviet Union, it acted as a limitation on what U.S. foreign policy could do. The African National Congress got aid from the Soviet Union. That made it possible for them to ultimately unseat the apartheid government and get Mandela out of jail. The Vietnamese got aid from the Soviet Union. That made it possible for them to fight against the French, the Japanese, the French again, and then the Americans. There isn't any such power to stand in the face of the U.S. now, so Bush and his ultra-right-wing group of advisors think they can run the world. Unfortunately, attempts to do that almost immediately produce alliances of other countries that can collectively successfully confront the U.S., and we're likely to be highly isolated and subject to numerous terrorist attacks from the desperate people that are left behind every time we bomb a country. No country in the world has more weapons of mass destruction than the United States. And the kind of behavior that George Bush is engaging in now makes the rest of the world think that the rogue superpower they're confronting, that irresponsibly uses weapons of mass destruction. Remember, the U.S. is the only country ever to use nuclear weapons against civilian targets in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Helen Caldicott argues that depleted uranium is another kind of nuclear war. It's without the blast, but you have the uranium after effects, the radiation after effects, so that essentially the U.S. war in Gulf the first time, in Kosovo, and in Afghanistan, depleted uranium weapons were used in all of those wars, so that those are areas in which the U.S. has carried out a kind of nuclear war since. It's clear the U.S. is the government that most makes the world uneasy. There was a poll done, an internet poll by Time magazine in Europe about a month ago, and they said, who do you think is the world's worst threat to peace in the year 2003? And they named three options: North Korea, Iraq, and the United States. The last time I checked the poll a couple of weeks ago, some 85% of the people answering the poll thought the United States was the most likely source of disruption of peace in the year 2003, the threat of war. And Korea and Iraq both had single percentile figures, single-digit figures. So it seems to me that most of the world is worried more about what the U.S. will do with its weapons of mass destruction. And it's not clear to me that with countries like the U.S. threatening nearly everyone, remember, Cheney said that this war against terrorism could last for 50 years against 50 or 60 countries, that kind of talk on the part of the nation that has and has used more weapons of mass destruction than any other country makes everyone very uneasy. It should make Americans uneasy, too. It's being done with our tax dollars and in our names, though not with our permission, since mostly it's done behind our backs. Well, our primary strategy is to try and pressure the state government not to allow them to be federalized. Governor Douglas has that power. Whether he chooses to use it or not is a question of how much political courage he has. We'd like to encourage him to be very courageous and to issue a stop order on any more federalization of Vermont National Guard. If an individual guardsman or reservist or active duty military person decides they want to resist, either by an open act of resistance, as some Guards people in other parts of the country have done, simply a refusal to report for duty, or to apply for a conscientious objector discharge, then the Burlington Area Draft and Military Consulars, which I'm part of, is ready and willing to help people with the legal assistance that they need. We also work with Citizen Soldier, a national organization that helps get people out of the military when they've come to realize they no longer share the values that they thought they had when they joined. I think it would be a mistake to blame individual soldiers who feel pushed into going, since I take it we're mostly socialized to obey orders. But it's also the case that the military, when it's being careful, has to acknowledge that since the Nuremberg trials, it's the case that U.S. soldiers aren't supposed to obey unlawful orders. They're never very helpful in telling you when it's an unlawful order, but in this case we have an undeclared war being carried out without UN approval, so that there are multiple levels in which a soldier might argue that being deployed for this war is an illegal order. That would have to be resolved in the courts, but what we're committed to doing is finding the legal assistance for people who decide to do that, or for people who'd like to apply for conscientious or hardship discharges. I take it many people sign up for the Guard and the Reserve not with the intention of being sent off to some foreign war, but because they want to help out here with crises of floods and ice storms and other things the Guard gets turned out for and serves a vital purpose. To be sent off to fight some inexplicable and unjustified war against a country that's already in a shambles is not likely to be the sort of thing that they volunteered for. So if people find themselves now sort of caught on the difference between current policy and why they joined, we're there to help them. Since one of the things that helped end the Vietnam War was massive resistance by troops on the ground in Vietnam itself, I think we need to try whatever we can think of that's effective, that's clear, easy for people to understand, and nonviolent as a way of bringing about confrontation with what seems to me to be a blatantly illegal government. If we sit quietly by and let an unelected president send us off to an illegal and immoral war, then I take it in some sense we've defeated ourselves as a country by failing to take the direction of our life in our own hands and away from people who've stolen it from us. The American people need to act, and not just wait till 2004 to act, but to talk about moving this person out of the White House, to get the Congress to refit their spines back in place and actually impeach him, as well as deny him the opportunity to send troops to the Gulf. The Congress should be doing this, but since they're so spineless and the Democrats, the best they can do is advocate bombing North Korea instead of Iraq, they're hardly an anti-war opposition, that we need to seize control of our government back from the people who've stolen it from us. I was rereading the Declaration of Independence the other day, and there's nothing about it that's rendered null and void by the Constitution. When oppressive governments are opposed to the interests and needs of the people, they have the right and the duty to overthrow those governments. And if we can't get the Constitution to be observed in any other way, then I take it that revolution is the historically favored solution that Americans have used.